The sound of a single gunshot echoed across Panamint Valley, California, in the autumn of 1875, as Preston Nathans stood rigid before a fresh grave, his eyes as dry and hard as the surrounding desert. The dirt had barely settled on the small plot that now held his wife and infant son, taken by a fever that swept through the mining town with merciless speed. 3 days of hell, and then silence, the kind that follows a man like a shadow. "That'll be all, Reverend," Preston said, his voice low and rough from disuse. The few townsfolk who had gathered for the burial shifted uncomfortably in the morning chill, exchanging glances that spoke volumes about the young rancher who had, in the span of a week, become as remote as the distant Sierra peaks. Sheriff Hollis patted Preston's shoulder. "Son, you know you're welcome to stay with Martha and me for a spell." Preston shook his head once, sharp and final. "Got cattle that need tending." His words sliced through offers of company and comfort like a knife. At 32, he had already built and lost more than most men twice his age. The small gathering dispersed, boots shuffling through the dust, leaving Preston alone with 2 wooden crosses and the vast emptiness of the Panamint Valley spread before him. He placed a single desert wildflower on the smaller of the graves, his calloused hand lingering for a moment before he straightened, adjusted his hat against the sun, and walked toward his horse without looking back. The 15-mile ride to his ranch passed in a blur of dust and sage. Sagebrush Ranch, named by Sarah when they'd first staked their claim 5 years prior, sprawled across 300 acres of rugged land dotted with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings. It wasn't the easiest place to raise cattle, but Preston had made it work through sheer determination, building a modest operation that supported them and the handful of ranch hands he employed. As he approached the ranch house, a sturdy 2-story structure of timber and stone, his foreman, Elijah Turner, emerged from the barn. "Boss," Elijah nodded solemnly, taking the reins of Preston's horse. At 55, the weathered cowhand had become something of a father figure to Preston over the years. "Boys and I got the north pasture fence mended. Herd's all accounted for." Preston nodded. "Obliged." He walked past Elijah toward the house, then paused. "Tell the men we're moving the herd to the high country day after tomorrow, earlier than planned." "But that's nearly 3 weeks ahead of schedule," Elijah protested. "We ain't fully provisioned and—" "Then provision," Preston cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "I need to keep moving." Over the next 18 months, Preston Nathans became a ghost of the man he once was. He worked from dawn until dusk, taking the most dangerous tasks upon himself, riding farther, pushing harder than any of his men. He expanded the ranch's borders, doubling its size through shrewd land acquisitions and relentless labor. When he spoke, which was rare, it was only of cattle, water rights, or ranch business. The piano in the front room that Sarah had loved gathered dust. The nursery upstairs remained locked. At night, when the bunkhouse was quiet and the vast desert sky pressed down with its weight of stars, Preston would sometimes sit on his porch, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, and stare out at the darkness as if daring it to take something else from him. The town of Panamint grew during this time, with the silver mines bringing prosperity and new settlers. Preston avoided town when possible, sending Elijah or one of the other hands for supplies. When forced to go himself, he conducted his business efficiently, rebuffing attempts at conversation from townsfolk who remembered the young man who used to laugh freely with his pretty wife on Saturday evenings. "That Nathans fella," the new barber remarked to Sheriff Hollis one afternoon, "seems like he's carved from stone." "Grief does that to some men," Hollis replied, watching through the window as Preston loaded supplies into his wagon outside the general store. "Freezes him from the inside out." "Shame," the barber said. "Man that young." "Wasn't always that way," the sheriff said quietly. "Used to be you couldn't find a more good-natured soul in 3 counties. Him and Sarah were something to see together." Preston completed his loading, climbed onto the wagon seat, and snapped the reins, leaving Panamint and its whispers behind. Spring arrived in 1877 with unusually heavy rains, turning the valley briefly green and causing the mountain streams to swell. Preston stood at the edge of his property, surveying a washed-out section of fence when he heard the distant sound of a wagon struggling along the muddy road that connected Panamint to the neighboring town of Lone Pine. He wouldn't have paid it any mind travelers came through occasionally, but the sharp crack of a wheel braking followed by a woman's startled cry drew his attention. Sighing with irritation, Preston mounted his horse and rode toward the sound. He found a mud-splattered wagon tilted precariously off the road, its right front wheel completely shattered. A young woman in a blue traveling dress was attempting to calm a nervous horse while simultaneously trying to extract a trunk from the wagon bed. "Madam," Preston called as he approached, "you're going to spook that horse pulling on your trunk like that." The woman turned, and Preston felt something unexpected, a momentary jolt, like stepping into sunlight after too long indoors. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a practical bonnet and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. "I'm well aware of that, sir," she replied, brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "But as I seem to be stranded in the middle of nowhere with night approaching, I thought I might at least secure my belongings before addressing the larger problem." There was something in her direct gaze that made Preston straighten slightly in his saddle. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him without pity or wariness. "Where are you headed?" he asked, dismounting and approaching the wagon. "Panamint. I'm to be the new schoolteacher," she said, offering her hand with surprising formality given their circumstances. "Josephine Fletcher. Most call me Josie." Preston hesitated before taking her hand briefly. "Preston Nathans. My ranch is about 3 miles east. Town's another 12 beyond that." He assessed the wagon. "This wheel's beyond repair. You can wait with your things while I fetch my wagon, or I can take you to the ranch now and come back for your trunk." Josie Fletcher considered him for a moment, as if weighing not just his offer, but the man himself. "I appreciate your help, Mr. Nathans. I'll wait with my things if it's not too much trouble for you to return with your wagon." Preston nodded and remounted his horse. "I'll be back within the hour." True to his word, Preston returned with a sturdy wagon. He worked efficiently, transferring Josie's trunk and smaller bags while she stood watching, occasionally offering assistance, which he declined with terse politeness. "Have you lived in this area long, Mr. Nathans?" she asked as they started toward the ranch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley. "Long enough," Preston replied, keeping his eyes on the road. After a moment's silence, he added grudgingly, "Almost 7 years." "It's beautiful country," she said, seemingly undeterred by his brevity. "Different from Ohio, more expansive." Preston glanced at her. "Ohio's a long way to travel for a teaching position." A fleeting shadow crossed her face. "Sometimes a fresh start requires distance." She turned to him with a smile that transformed her face entirely, lighting up her eyes. "Besides, I've always believed that adventure waits for those willing to seek it out." Something tightened in Preston's chest, a forgotten muscle flexing painfully after long disuse. He looked away, snapping the reins lightly to urge the horses forward. The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise. The main house, bunkhouse, barn, and corrals spread across the landscape, backed by the purple shadows of the mountains. "Your ranch is impressive," Josie remarked. "Do you manage it alone?" "Got 5 hands that work year-round, more during roundup and branding." He pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. "You can rest inside while I see to the horses. We'll head to town after." Josie hesitated. "Mr. Nathans, I don't wish to be a bother, but it's getting late. Would it be possible to impose on your hospitality for the night and continue to Panamint in the morning? I'm expected at Mrs. Whitley's boarding house, but not specifically today." Preston frowned, uncomfortable with the idea of a woman in his house, Sarah's house, after all this time. But the alternative was driving 12 miles in increasing darkness over muddy roads. "That would be sensible," he conceded stiffly. "I'll have my housekeeper prepare a room." Josie's eyes widened slightly. "You have a housekeeper? Out here?" "Mrs. Espinoza comes from town 3 times a week," Preston explained, feeling defensive. She'll be here tomorrow, but I can manage dinner well enough. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Preston opened the door to a house that contained another living soul besides himself. He showed Josie to the parlor, acutely aware of the dust that had accumulated on surfaces. Mrs. Espinosa wasn't allowed to touch Sarah's books, the photograph frames, the piano. "Please, make yourself comfortable," he said awkwardly. "I'll see to dinner." In the kitchen, Preston busied himself with preparations, grateful for the simple tasks that required no thought. He could hear occasional movement from the parlor's soft footsteps, the creak of the settee. When he returned to call her to dinner, he found Josie standing by the mantel, studying the framed photograph of himself and Sarah on their wedding day. She turned quickly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." "It's displayed for a reason," Preston said, though he hadn't looked at the photograph himself in months. "Dinner's ready." The meal was simple beans, leftover biscuits, and salt pork. But Josie expressed her appreciation with what seemed genuine gratitude. She attempted conversation several times, asking about his cattle operation, the history of Panamint, and the school where she would be teaching. Preston answered directly but briefly, offering no openings for personal questions. Still, there was something disarming about Josephine Fletcher. Perhaps it was the way she listened intently when he spoke, or how she filled silences not with nervous chatter, but with a comfortable ease that suggested she was accustomed to quiet companionship. By the time they had finished eating, Preston had volunteered more information about the valley's weather patterns and the town's mining operations than he'd shared with anyone in recent memory. "The school's small," he found himself saying as they finished their coffee, "but the mining families are particular about education. Previous teacher, Miss Harrington, left to get married." "And what about your children, Mr. Nathans?" Josie asked innocently. "Will they be attending my school?" The question hit Preston like a physical blow. He set down his cup with a sharp click. "No," he said, pushing back from the table. "I'll show you to your room." He led her upstairs without another word, pointing out the washroom and providing a spare nightgown that had belonged to Sarah, an act that surprised even himself before bidding her a curt good night. In his own room, Preston sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, wondering why he had allowed this disruption to his carefully constructed solitude. Tomorrow, he would deliver Miss Fletcher to Panamint, and things would return to normal. But as he lay sleepless in the darkness, he could not shake the memory of her smile, bright and genuine as morning sunlight, and how for just a moment it had warmed something he had thought permanently frozen. Morning came with clearing skies and the first real warmth of spring. Preston rose early, as was his habit, and was surprised to find Josie already in the kitchen, attempting to navigate the wood stove. "Good morning, Mr. Nathans," she said, a streak of flour on her cheek. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to repay your hospitality with breakfast." Preston stood awkwardly in the doorway, suddenly conscious of his unshaven face and rumpled shirt. That wasn't necessary. Perhaps not, but necessary things are rarely as satisfying as those done from gratitude, she replied, turning back to the stove. "I'm afraid I'm more accustomed to coal stoves, but I believe I've managed not to ruin these flapjacks entirely." The domesticity of the scene, a woman in his kitchen, the smell of coffee and cooking created a peculiar ache in Preston's chest. He pushed it aside, moving to the pump to wash his hands and face. They ate breakfast with less tension than the previous evening's meal, with Josie asking practical questions about Panamint, the layout of the town, the school's condition, the families she would be teaching. "Sheriff and Mrs. Hollis have 2 boys in school," Preston told her, surprising himself by remembering this detail. "Good kids, but spirited. The Donovan twins are sharp as tacks, but full of mischief." Josie's eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "Every classroom needs a few mischief makers. They keep a teacher honest." "That so?" Preston found himself asking. "Absolutely. Children who question things, who test boundaries, they're usually the ones with the most potential." She took a sip of coffee. "Were you such a child, Mr. Nathans?" The question caught him off guard. "I suppose I had my moments." "I thought as much," she said with a knowing look that almost drew a smile from him. As they prepared to depart for town, Preston found himself moving with less haste than he would have expected. He instructed Elijah about the day's tasks, loaded Josie's trunk onto the wagon, and checked the horses with deliberate care. The journey to Panamint passed more quickly than Preston anticipated. Josie seemed content to admire the landscape for stretches of time, then would ask a thoughtful question about ranching or comment on something she observed. It was the most comfortable conversation Preston had experienced in years, partly because she didn't push when he fell silent and seemed to genuinely appreciate his sparse explanations. As they approached the outskirts of town, Preston became increasingly aware of the attention they would draw him. Bringing a young woman into Panamint would set tongues wagging immediately. "Mrs. Whitley's boarding house is on the east end of town," he said as they passed the first buildings. "It's respectable. Mostly houses unmarried lady teachers and the occasional traveler." "Is Mrs. Whitley herself respectable?" Josie asked with a hint of mischief. "Formidable might be a better word," Preston replied, surprising himself with the assessment. "Widowed during the war, runs a tight establishment, no callers after 8, no spirits on the premises." "She sounds perfect," Josie said, smoothing her travel-rumpled dress. "I appreciate you warning me." Preston felt an unexpected urge to smile. "Consider it part of the transportation service." As they pulled up to the neat white boarding house with its small front garden, several faces appeared at windows, confirming Preston's prediction about town gossip. He helped Josie down from the wagon with formal correctness, then unloaded her trunk while she approached the door. Mrs. Whitley, a tall, silver-haired woman with impeccable posture, appeared on the porch, greeting Josie with restrained warmth before fixing her sharp eyes on Preston. "Mr. Nathans," she said with a nod that conveyed both respect and caution. "It's been some time since you've been seen in this part of town." "Madam?" Preston acknowledged, setting Josie's trunk on the porch. "Miss Fletcher's wagon had an accident on the road yesterday. I offered assistance." "How fortunate she had a gentleman nearby," Mrs. Whitley replied, her expression softening slightly. "Won't you come in for refreshment?" Preston shook his head. "Thank you, but I have business to attend to." He turned to Josie, who was watching him with those perceptive amber eyes. "Miss Fletcher, welcome to Panamint." "Thank you, Mr. Nathans," she said, extending her hand. When he took it, she added quietly, "For everything." Something in her tone made Preston hold her gaze longer than was strictly proper. Then he tipped his hat, released her hand, and returned to his wagon. As he drove toward the general store, Preston was uncomfortably aware of the stares and whispers that followed him. It had been months since he'd spent more than a few necessary minutes in town, and now he had arrived escorting the new schoolteacher, subject of much anticipation in a community starved for new faces. At the general store, old Mr. Finch couldn't contain his curiosity. "See you brought in the new teacher, Nathans," he remarked as Preston selected supplies. "Seems like a fine young lady." "She had wagon trouble," Preston replied flatly. "Nothing more to it than that." Finch nodded too understandingly. Course. Still, nice to see you doing a good turn. Sarah would have— "I'll take 20 pounds of flour instead of 10, Preston interrupted, his voice hardening at the mention of his wife's name. "And another box of ammunition." The rest of his errands passed in a blur of terse interactions. By the time Preston headed back to the ranch, his jaw ached from clenching, and he was grimly determined to put the disruption of the past 24 hours behind him. Miss Fletcher would settle into her teaching position, and he would return to the isolated routine he had perfected. Yet, as the miles between himself and Panamint grew, Preston found his thoughts returning unbidden to Josie's direct gaze, her thoughtful questions, and most persistently, to her smile, genuine and warm as a hearth fire on a cold night. 3 weeks passed before Preston saw Josephine Fletcher again. He had successfully avoided town, sending ranch hands for supplies and focusing on spring calving, which kept him in the saddle from dawn to dusk. If his dreams occasionally featured auburn hair and whiskey-colored eyes, he dismissed such notions upon waking. It was a Saturday when circumstances forced his hand. One of his best breeding bulls had developed an infection that wasn't responding to the usual remedies, and the town's veterinarian, Dr. Miller, needed to be summoned. Rather than send a hand, Preston rode to Panamint himself, reasoning that he could better explain the animal's symptoms. After arranging for Dr. Miller to visit the ranch the following morning, Preston intended to leave town immediately. But as he passed the schoolhouse on his way out, the sound of laughter drew his attention. Several children were in the schoolyard, despite it being the weekend, gathered around a figure he instantly recognized. Josie sat on the edge of the schoolhouse steps, reading aloud from a book while a dozen children listened with rapt attention. Her voice carried clearly in the spring air, animated and expressive as she narrated what sounded like an adventure tale. At a particularly dramatic moment, she paused, and the children leaned forward in anticipation. Preston found himself slowing his horse, then stopping altogether to listen. Josie looked up, seeming to sense his presence, and their eyes met across the schoolyard. Without breaking stride in her storytelling, she smiled that sunshine smile that had haunted his thoughts and gave a small wave of acknowledgement before returning her attention to her young audience. That brief connection, her recognition, his presence, stirred something in Preston he thought long buried. He nodded once, then continued on his way, unsettled by how that simple moment had affected him. The next day, after Dr. Miller had treated the bull and departed, Preston found himself restless. Rather than joining the hands for Sunday dinner in the bunkhouse as he occasionally did, he saddled his horse and rode out, with no particular destination in mind. It wasn't entirely surprising when he found himself on the road to town, nor that his path took him near the small church where most of Panamint's residents gathered on Sunday mornings. The service had just concluded, with people lingering on the church steps and lawn in the pleasant spring weather. Preston kept his distance, watching from the shade of an ancient cottonwood. He spotted Josie easily, wearing a pale yellow dress that caught the sunlight, surrounded by several women who appeared to be introducing her to others. She smiled and nodded, but there was something in her posture that suggested a certain reserve beneath her friendly demeanor. As if sensing his gaze, Josie glanced in his direction. For a moment, Preston thought about turning away, pretending he hadn't been watching. Instead, he stayed where he was, acknowledging her with a slight nod when their eyes met. To his surprise, Josie excused herself from her companions and began walking toward him. Preston straightened, suddenly conscious of his work clothes and unshaven face among the Sunday finery of the churchgoers. "Mr. Nathans," she greeted him as she approached, her voice carrying a genuine warmth that seemed reserved for him alone. "How lovely to see you again." "Miss Fletcher," he replied with a nod. "I trust you're settling into town well enough?" "I am, thank you." She glanced back at the dispersing congregation, "though I'm still learning everyone's names and connections. Small towns have complicated social maps." "That they do," Preston agreed, shifting slightly. "And the school?" Josie's face brightened. "Wonderful. 23 students ages 6 to 16. We're making progress, though the building itself could use some repairs." She studied him for a moment. "Have you come to town for church?" "No," Preston said quickly, then felt compelled to explain. "I had business nearby and was just passing through." "I see." Josie didn't press further, which Preston appreciated. Instead, she asked, "How's your ranch faring this spring?" The genuine interest in her question loosened something in Preston's chest. "Well enough. Calving season's been successful. Had some trouble with a bull yesterday, but the vet thinks he'll recover." "I'm glad to hear it," she said, then hesitated. "Mr. Nathans, some of the children have been asking about ranch life. Many have never seen a working cattle operation up close. I wonder if someday when it's convenient, of course we might arrange a visit to your ranch, for educational purposes." The request caught Preston off guard. His ranch had not welcomed visitors, especially children, in years. The thought of young voices and laughter in spaces that had known only silence was both unsettling and, strangely, not entirely unwelcome. "I'd need to consider it," he said finally. "It's a busy time of year." Of course, Josie nodded, no disappointment visible in her expression. It was just a thought. The children are curious about everything, and I try to encourage their interest in the world around them. Before Preston could respond, Mrs. Whitley approached. Her expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity at finding her boarder conversing with the reclusive rancher. "Miss Fletcher," she said, "Dr. and Mrs. Bailey have invited us for Sunday dinner. We shouldn't keep them waiting." "Yes, of course," Josie agreed. She turned back to Preston. "It was good to see you again, Mr. Nathans." As she walked away with Mrs. Whitley, Preston heard the older woman's hushed voice. "Mr. Nathans keeps to himself these days, dear. Has done since the tragedy." Preston mounted his horse and rode away, his thoughts in turmoil. The tragedy, such a small word for the cataclysm that had shattered his world. He wondered what Josie would think when she inevitably learned the details of his past, when her friendly interest would transform into the same pitying looks he received from everyone else in town. The thought bothered him more than it should have. Over the next several weeks, Preston found reasons to visit Panamint with increasing frequency. He discovered that Josie took her lunch in the small park near the school on pleasant days, and occasionally his errands coincided with this timing. Their conversations were brief but gradually less formal, with Josie sharing amusing anecdotes about her students, and Preston reluctantly offering updates about ranch operations. "Tommy Donovan asked me yesterday if cows sleep standing up," Josie told him one afternoon in early May, laughing at the memory. When I admitted I wasn't certain, he declared that his next investigation would require sleeping in a pasture to find out. "They do and they don't," Preston found himself explaining. "They can doze standing up, but they lie down for deep sleep." "Really?" Josie's eyes lit with genuine interest. "Now I'll have something definitive to tell Tommy on Monday." These encounters, brief though they were, began to take on significance in Preston's otherwise solitary existence. He found himself thinking about things he might tell Josie during their next chance meeting about a particularly clever calf, or the family of hawks nesting near the creek. Small observations he hadn't shared with anyone in years. The town noticed, of course. Preston became aware of speculative glances and hushed conversations that stopped when he approached. Sheriff Hollis finally addressed it directly one afternoon as Preston was loading supplies. "Good to see you in town more regular-like," Hollis said, leaning against the hitching post. "Folks are starting to remember you're part of this community." Preston secured a sack of grain in his wagon. "Just taking care of business, Sheriff." "Course you are," Hollis agreed too easily. "Miss Fletcher seems to be fitting in well." "Bright young woman." Preston gave him a sharp look. "I wouldn't know." "No?" Hollis raised an eyebrow. "My Martha says you and the schoolteacher seem to have struck up a friendship. Says it's good to see." "Your Martha should mind her own affairs," Preston said, though without real heat. "Miss Fletcher's just being neighborly." "Neighborly," Hollis repeated thoughtfully. "Well, neighbor, just so you know, half the unmarried men in town have already come calling at Mrs. Whitley's with flowers and invitations. So far, Miss Fletcher's been polite but uninterested." He pushed away from the post. "Thought you might want to know that particular piece of business." As May turned to June, Preston found himself considering Josie's request about bringing her students to the ranch. The idea no longer seemed as intrusive as it once had. One evening, after a day spent mending fences in the north pasture, he mentioned it to Elijah over coffee. "The schoolteacher asked about bringing children here," he said, trying to sound casual. "For educational purposes." Elijah looked up from his cup, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Here? To Sagebrush?" "She thinks they should see a working ranch." Preston shrugged. "Probably not practical." Elijah considered this. "Well, roundup's done. Things are quieter now than they'll become fall. Could be managed if you wanted." He studied Preston carefully. "Would do the place good to hear young voices again." Preston stared into his coffee. Maybe. The next time Preston saw Josie in town, he approached her with uncharacteristic purpose, catching her as she was leaving the mercantile with a stack of books. "Miss Fletcher," he said, taking the heavy books from her arms before she could protest. "I've considered your request about the students visiting the ranch." Josie's face brightened. "And Friday next week would be suitable if that works for your schedule. They could see the operation, learn about cattle raising, maybe have lunch by the creek." Preston found the words tumbling out more easily than expected. "If you still think it would be educational." "Mr. Nathans, that would be wonderful." Josie's smile was radiant. "The children will be thrilled." "Are you certain it's not too much trouble?" "It's no trouble," Preston said, surprised to find he meant it. "I'll arrange for a wagon to bring you all out and back." As he walked Josie back to the schoolhouse, carrying her books, Preston was acutely aware of the townsfolk watching them with undisguised interest. For once, he found he didn't care what they thought. The morning of the school visit dawned clear and mild. Preston had spent the previous days in unexpected preparation, ensuring the ranch yard was tidy, having the hand-set-up tables under the cottonwoods by the creek, even asking Mrs. Espinosa to bake extra cookies for the children. He told himself these efforts were about presenting his operation in a professional light, but even Elijah's knowing glances couldn't dampen his unusual energy. When the wagon arrived carrying Josie and 18 excited children, Preston felt a momentary panic. What had he been thinking, inviting this chaos into his carefully ordered world? But then Josie stepped down from the wagon, wearing a practical blue skirt and white shirtwaist, her hair partially contained under a wide-brimmed hat, and smiled at him with such genuine appreciation that his reservations faded. "Children," she called, bringing order to the chattering group, "please thank Mr. Nathans for inviting us to his ranch today." "Thank you, Mr. Nathans," they chorused with varying degrees of enthusiasm and volume. Preston nodded awkwardly. "Welcome to Sagebrush Ranch. I thought we'd start with a tour of the main buildings, then see some of the cattle. After lunch, those who are interested can learn about the equipment we use." The day unfolded better than Preston could have anticipated. The children's curiosity was genuine, their questions endless, but mostly thoughtful. He found himself explaining aspects of ranching he hadn't articulated in years, how cattle were bred for specific traits, how the natural cycle of seasons dictated ranch operations, how each hand specialized in different tasks. Throughout it all, Josie was present but unobtrusive, occasionally guiding the children's attention or helping manage their energy, but mostly allowing Preston to lead. He caught her watching him several times with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, something like admiration mixed with curiosity. During lunch by the creek, Preston found himself sitting beside her on a blanket while the children explored the shallow water under the watchful eyes of Elijah and 2 other hands. "You're very good with them," Josie observed, nodding toward where Preston had earlier demonstrated to a group of boys how to properly coil a lariat. "They respect you." Preston shrugged. "Children appreciate honesty, and they can sense when you respect their intelligence." "Exactly my teaching philosophy," Josie said with evident pleasure. "Though I admit some days it's tested severely." She looked out over the ranch. "You've built something remarkable here, Mr. Nathans." "Preston," he said suddenly, "if we're to be friends, you might as well use my given name." Josie turned to him, surprise and pleasure warming her eyes. "Preston," she repeated, testing the name. "Then you must call me Josie. Miss Fletcher makes me feel as though I'm perpetually in the schoolroom." "Josie," he agreed, the name feeling right on his tongue. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the sounds of children laughing and the gentle murmur of the creek. For the first time in years, Preston felt something like peace in the presence of another person. As the day drew to a close and the children were loaded back into the wagon, tired but exuberant from their adventure, Josie lingered behind to speak with Preston privately. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "It meant more than you know to the children, and to me." Preston found himself wanting to prolong the moment. Perhaps you'd like to come back sometime, on your own. I could show you more of the ranch." The invitation surprised them both, but Josie recovered quickly. "I'd like that very much." As the wagon pulled away, with children waving and calling their goodbyes, Preston stood in the yard long after the dust had settled, aware that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully constructed solitude. The days following the school visit took on a new rhythm for Preston. He found legitimate reasons to visit Panamint more frequently, and Josie began accompanying him on Sunday afternoon rides that gradually extended into longer explorations of the valley. They established a pattern of easy companionship, sharing observations and stories without pressing too deeply into painful territory. But as June turned to July, bringing intense heat to the valley, Preston found himself increasingly troubled by the growing closeness between them. One evening, after riding together to a high meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the summer heat, Preston finally voiced his concern. "People are talking," he said abruptly, as they sat beside their horses in the shade of a juniper tree. "About us." Josie looked at him steadily. "People generally do talk in small towns. Does it bother you?" Preston picked at a blade of grass. "They don't understand." "What don't they understand?" she asked gently. He struggled to articulate the complicated emotions that had been building within him. I can't offer what they think I'm offering." Understanding dawned in Josie's eyes. "Preston, I haven't asked anything of you that you haven't freely given your friendship, your time. But you deserve more," he said, the words escaping before he could reconsider them. "Someone whole." Josie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze on the distant mountains. "Do you know why I came to Panamint?" she finally asked. When Preston shook his head, she continued. "I was engaged to be married in Ohio. Edward was a banker's son, respectable, secure, the kind of match my parents had always hoped for." Preston watched her profile, surprised by this revelation. "3 weeks before the wedding, I found him with another woman, my cousin actually." Josie's voice was steady, matter of fact. When confronted, Edward explained that while I would make a suitable wife, I shouldn't expect his complete fidelity, that such arrangements were common among men of his station. "He was a fool," Preston said with unexpected heat. Josie smiled slightly. "Yes, he was. But the scandal nearly destroyed my family's standing. My father's business suffered. I knew I needed to leave to give them distance from the gossip." She turned to look directly at Preston. "So I understand something about starting over, about rebuilding a life from broken pieces, about feeling less than whole." The honesty in her words created a space between them that felt both vulnerable and safe. Preston found himself wanting to fill it with his own truth. "I had a wife," he said, his voice low, "Sarah, and a son, William. They died of fever nearly 2 years ago. William was just 4 months old." Josie's hand found his, her touch gentle but firm. "I know," she said softly. "Mrs. Whitley told me your history shortly after we met. She thought it important I understand why you were—" "As you are," Preston stiffened. "And what am I?" "Careful," Josie said simply. "Protective of what remains, living with grief like a companion you neither welcome nor dismiss." She squeezed his hand. "I don't presume to understand the depth of your loss, Preston, but I recognize the courage it takes to continue living afterward." Something inside Preston shifted a crack in the ice that had encased his heart for so long. He didn't pull his hand away from hers, and they sat in companionable silence as the sunset painted the valley in gold and crimson. As they rode back to town in the gathering dusk, Preston felt both lighter and more troubled than before. Josie had seen him clearly, his damage, his defenses, and had neither pitied nor pressured him. She had simply acknowledged his pain as real while suggesting it need not be permanent. The thought was as terrifying as it was liberating. Summer blazed across Panamint Valley, bringing heat that shimmered across the landscape and drove people to seek shade during the hottest parts of the day. Despite the discomfort, Preston found himself looking forward to Josie's visits to the ranch, which had become a regular Sunday occurrence. They would ride in the cooler morning hours, then return to the house where Preston would prepare a simple meal that they ate on the shaded porch. It was during one such Sunday in late July that Preston realized how much his home had changed. Fresh wildflowers now graced the table that had gathered only dust for years. Windows stood open to catch any hint of breeze. Curtains that had remained drawn were now tied back to admit sunlight. Even more striking were the changes in himself. He spoke more, laughed occasionally, and found himself thinking of the future rather than dwelling in the past. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Josie asked, interrupting his reflections as they sat on the porch after their meal. Preston considered his answer carefully. "Change," he said finally. "How it comes whether you want it or not." "Is this change unwelcome?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "No," Preston admitted, surprising himself with his certainty. "Just unexpected." Josie nodded, seeming to understand what he couldn't fully express. The best things often are. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Preston stood, instantly alert. Visitors to Sagebrush were rare, especially on Sundays. He recognized the riders as they drew closer, Sheriff Hollis and Dr. Miller, both looking grim. "Trouble?" Preston called as they dismounted. "Afraid so," Hollis confirmed, touching his hat to Josie. "Miss Fletcher, didn't expect to find you here, though I suppose it's fortunate." "What's happened?" Preston asked, tension evident in his stance. Dr. Miller wiped sweat from his brow. "Diphtheria. 3 cases confirmed in town since yesterday. 2 minors' children and Mrs. Finch from the general store." Preston felt a cold chill, despite the summer heat. Diphtheria was a killer. The same disease that had taken Sarah and William had started with just a few cases before sweeping through town. "How bad?" he asked, his voice tight. "Bad enough," Hollis replied grimly. "Doctors, Miller thinks we need to close the school and limit gatherings until we see if it spreads further." Josie stepped forward. "Of course. What can I do to help?" Dr. Miller looked at her with appreciation. "We're setting up a temporary infirmary in the church hall. Could use educated hands to help with the nursing." "I'll return to town with you immediately," Josie said without hesitation. Preston felt a surge of protest rise within him. "That puts you at risk of infection." "It's my duty," Josie replied firmly, her eyes conveying both determination and understanding of his concern. "My students and their families need help." The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety for Preston. He wanted to go to town to see for himself that Josie was safe. But the memory of losing his family to similar circumstances kept him paralyzed with fear. Instead, he sent Elijah daily for news, pacing the ranch house as he awaited reports. The news grew worse before it improved. By the end of the week, 12 cases had been confirmed, with 2 deaths, both elderly residents with already fragile health. But then, the tide began to turn. New treatments Dr. Miller had learned about were showing promise, and strict quarantine measures seemed to be working. On the 10th day, Preston could bear it no longer. He rode to town at dawn, approaching the church that had been converted to an infirmary with dread coiling in his stomach. Sheriff Hollis met him outside, looking exhausted, but less grim than before. "She's all right," Hollis said immediately, correctly interpreting Preston's unspoken question. "Been working day and night, though. Might be good if you could convince her to rest." Inside, the church pews had been pushed aside to make room for beds. The space was quieter than Preston had feared, with only 5 patients remaining, all appearing to be on the road to recovery. He spotted Josie at the far end, reading softly to a small girl whose neck was wrapped in bandages. When she looked up and saw him, the smile that crossed her tired face sent a jolt through Preston's heart. She finished her paragraph, patted the girl's hand, and crossed to him. "Preston," she said, her voice hoarse from fatigue, "I didn't expect you to come." He took in her appearance, hair pulled back severely, dark shadows under her eyes, a smudge of something medicinal on her sleeve, and thought she had never looked more beautiful. "I had to see for myself that you were safe," he admitted. "Hollis says you haven't been resting." "There's been little time," she said, swaying slightly with exhaustion. Preston made a decision. "You're coming with me. Now, for at least a few hours of proper rest. To his surprise, Josie didn't argue. She spoke briefly with Dr. Miller, who nodded approvingly at Preston's insistence, then gathered her shawl. Once outside, Preston led her to his wagon rather than his horse. "I can't go all the way to the ranch," Josie protested weakly. "I need to be back for the evening treatments." "I've taken a room at the hotel," Preston explained, helping her up to the seat. "You'll rest there, where you can return quickly if needed." The small hotel on Panamin's main street was modest but clean. Preston escorted Josie to the room he had secured, acutely aware of the impropriety, but more concerned with her well-being than social conventions. "Sleep," he instructed, guiding her to sit on the bed. "I'll be in the chair if you need anything." Josie looked up at him, fatigue evident in every line of her body. "Why did you really come, Preston?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty. Preston knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Because I realized something when I thought you might be in danger," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I realized that losing you would break what's left of my heart, and I'm not ready to let that happen." Tears welled in Josie's eyes. "I'm not Sarah," she whispered. "I know," Preston said, reaching up to touch her cheek. "I don't want you to be. I want you to be Josie, the woman who brought sunshine back into my life when I thought I'd live in darkness forever." She leaned into his touch, eyes closing briefly. "I'm very tired," she murmured. "Sleep," he repeated gently. "We'll talk when you wake." Josie nodded, allowing him to help her lie down. Within moments, her breathing deepened into sleep, the lines of exhaustion gradually softening from her face. Preston settled into the chair across the room, content to watch over her as she rested. As he sat there, Preston confronted the truth he had been avoiding for weeks. He was falling in love with Josephine Fletcher. The realization should have terrified him, but instead, it filled him with a calm certainty. Loving Josie didn't diminish what he had shared with Sarah. It was simply a different chapter in his life, one he hadn't expected, but now couldn't imagine refusing. The diphtheria crisis passed, leaving Panamint shaken but largely intact. 2 more lives were lost, a minor newly arrived from Colorado and an infant born prematurely during the outbreak. The town mourned its losses while celebrating its resilience, and slowly, normal life resumed. For Preston and Josie, however, nothing would be quite the same again. The intensity of the crisis had accelerated the deepening of their relationship, bringing into focus feelings that might otherwise have developed more gradually. They began courting openly, no longer concerned with the town's speculation. August brought the hottest days of summer, but also the sweetest moments of Preston's renewed life. He and Josie established new patterns: Wednesday dinners at the ranch when school was not in session, Sunday rides into the higher country where temperatures were more moderate, occasional evenings on Mrs. Whitley's front porch, under her watchful but increasingly approving eye. One such evening in late August, as they sat watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Preston finally found the courage to address their future. "School starts again next week," he observed. "Yes," Josie agreed. "I'm looking forward to it, though I'll miss our Wednesday dinners." Preston nodded, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about that, about arrangements and such." Josie turned to look at him, a question in her eyes. "The thing is," Preston continued, uncharacteristically hesitant, "the ranch is a fair distance from town. Makes courting complicated." "I hadn't noticed you minding the ride," Josie teased gently. "I don't," Preston assured her. "But winter will come, roads get bad, and it seems inefficient to maintain 2 households when—" He stopped, aware he was approaching this all wrong. Josie waited patiently, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Preston took a deep breath and tried again, turning to face her directly. "Josie, I love you. I think I have since that first day when you stood in the mud beside your broken wagon and looked at me like I was just a man, not a tragedy walking. You've brought light and laughter back into my life when I thought both were gone forever." Tears gathered in Josie's eyes, but her smile remained steady. "I know it hasn't been that long," Preston continued, taking her hands in his. and I know there's still grief in me that may never fully heal. But if you could consider becoming my wife, I promise to cherish every day we're given together." "Preston," Josie said softly, her voice full of emotion, "are you certain? This is a significant step." "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied, squeezing her hands gently. "I don't want to waste any more time living half a life." Josie's smile bloomed fully then, bright as the sunrise. "In that case, Mr. Nathans, I accept your proposal. Though you should know, I intend to continue teaching at least until spring." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Preston assured her. "Your students need you." He paused, then added with unexpected lightness, "And I suspect Mrs. Whitley would have my hide if I took you away mid-term." Josie laughed a sound that still sent warmth through Preston's chest every time he heard it. "She absolutely would, though I think she's grown rather fond of you these past months." "The feeling is mutual," Preston admitted, "though I'll never tell her so." The wedding took place in early October, when the desert heat had subsided and the landscape was touched with the gold of autumn. The entire town of Panamint turned out for the occasion, the church filled to capacity and then some, with miners and ranch hands standing in the back and children perched in windows to witness the event. Preston stood at the altar in a new suit, watching as Josie walked toward him on Sheriff Hollis's arm. Her parents, unable to travel from Ohio, had sent their heartfelt blessing by telegraph. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her auburn hair crowned with desert wildflowers, and her smile, that sunshine smile that had first warmed his frozen heart, was radiant with joy and promise. As they exchanged vows, Preston felt the last of his protective walls crumble. There would always be grief in his past. Sarah and William would forever be a part of his story. But he now understood that love wasn't limited or diminished by previous loss. It simply grew in new directions, like a tree sending out fresh branches after a harsh winter. The celebration afterward was held at Sagebrush Ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwoods and lanterns hung from branches to illuminate the festivities as evening fell. Preston watched as Josie moved among their guests, her laughter mingling with the music provided by a trio of miners who doubled as fiddlers. Elijah approached, offering Preston a glass of whiskey. "Never thought I'd see Sagebrush looking like this again," the old foreman said, gesturing to the lights in celebration. "Does my heart good." Preston nodded, accepting the drink. "Mine too." "Sarah would approve," Elijah added quietly. "She never would have wanted you to stay frozen in grief." "I know," Preston replied, and found that he truly did. "Took me too long to realize it, though." "Better late than never," Elijah shrugged, then grinned as Josie approached them. "Are you two hiding from the dancing?" she asked, her eyes bright with happiness. Elijah made a show of backing away. "Just delivering refreshment to the groom, madam. I'll leave you two be." As the foreman disappeared into the crowd, Josie slipped her hand into Preston's. "Happy?" she asked. Preston set his untouched whiskey aside and pulled her gently into his arms. "More than I thought possible," he admitted, lowering his head to kiss her briefly. "You've given me a second chance at life, Josie Nathans." "We've given each other that gift," she corrected, leaning into his embrace, "and I intend to make the most of every moment." The ranch house that had once echoed with silence gradually filled with new sounds. Josie's humming as she graded papers in the evenings, lively discussions over dinner, occasional visitors now that Preston no longer discouraged company. The piano was tuned, and Josie's playing filled the parlor on winter evenings when snow dusted the valley and kept them close to home. During the Christmas holiday, they finally opened the nursery that had remained locked for so long. Together, they sorted through tiny clothes and toys, Preston sharing memories of Sarah's preparations and hopes. There were tears, but they were healing tears, washing away the last vestiges of bitterness that had clung to his grief. "We'll use this room again someday," Josie said softly as they stood together in the doorway afterward. "When you're ready." Preston pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I think I might be ready sooner than I expected," he murmured. Spring arrived with its usual drama of wild blooms and sudden storms. Josie completed her first full year of teaching with a celebration that brought the entire town to the schoolhouse. As Preston watched his wife accepting the community's appreciation, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 1 year. On the anniversary of their first meeting, the day Josie's wagon had broken down on the road to Panamint, Preston surprised her with a picnic at the same spot. "You know," Josie said as they spread a blanket under the shade of a juniper tree, "when I first saw you riding toward me that day, I thought you looked like the loneliest man I'd ever seen." Preston raised an eyebrow. "Not the most gallant man, not the most handsome." Josie laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. "Oh, handsome, certainly, but so contained, like you'd built walls around yourself that no one could breach." "And yet you did," Preston observed, watching her unpack their meal. "I simply recognized someone who needed sunshine," Josie replied. She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Preston, I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made his heart skip. "Good news or bad?" Josie's smile returned, more radiant than ever. "The very best news, I think. Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby in November." Preston stared at her, a flood of emotions washing through him: joy, fear, hope, and a momentary sharp grief for the son he had lost. But as he looked at Josie, his wife, his love, the woman who had brought him back to life, the joy overwhelmed everything else. "A baby," he repeated, reaching for her hands. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Josie asked, her eyes searching his. Preston pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if to protect both her and the new life she carried. "Happier than I have words to express," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you, Josie, for everything." As they sat together in the desert sunshine, planning for their future and the new life that would join them, Preston Nathans marveled at how completely his heart had thawed. The grief would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he was defined by love renewed, by hope restored, and by the extraordinary woman who had arrived in his life with sunshine in her smile and had changed everything. Their son, James Elijah Nathans, was born as the first snow dusted the Panamint Valley that November. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's steady gaze. As Preston held his newborn son, with Josie watching tiredly but happily from their bed, he felt the circle of life completing itself, not erasing what had come before, but adding to it, expanding it with new joy and possibility. "He's perfect," Preston whispered, carefully returning the baby to Josie's arms. "He is," she agreed, her smile soft with exhaustion, but radiant with happiness. "And so is this our life together." Preston settled beside them on the bed, his family gathered close as snow fell gently outside the window. In the quiet of that moment, he sent a silent thought of gratitude to Sarah, wherever she might be, for the love they had shared, and for somehow guiding him to this new chapter, to Josie, to James, to a heart once frozen by grief, now fully thawed and beating strong with love.